Go right ahead.
Thank you, Robin. Hello, everyone. So today we will be presenting, I'll be presenting on Dynamics AX 2012 coding best practices and development tips and design patterns. Uh, my name is Shankar Iyer. I have been a AX developer for like past 6 years now. I have worked in different roles of as a developer, as a system administrator, sometimes as a technical subject matter expert and an architect too. So I work for a company called as IMT Partnership. You can always follow my blog at iyertutor.blogspot.com. So today's agenda, what we will be covering today would be what are the different Microsoft Dynamics AX 2012 design patterns, what are the best practices which a developer can follow. Like there are a lot of them. I have shot down some of them, which we will be covering, and then development tips and tricks in AX 2012. So all these topics are very vast topics. Obviously, I cannot cover everything in this session, but I have selected few of them and which we will be presenting today. So design patterns. So there are like in a AX world or in a AX architecture, in a free tier architecture where there is a client, there is a AOS, and there is a database. Inside the client, there are lots of forms, there are lots of tables, there are lots of menus, menu items, and the list goes on. But what should be a particular design pattern which a developer should keep in mind when he is trying to code? So there are several design patterns prescribed by Microsoft. The ones which we are going to discuss today are, first would be the instantiating application objects design pattern. Then the next would be searching for records design pattern, parameter system design pattern, multi-selection design pattern, and change company design pattern. The first one is instantiating application object design pattern. So you often go to any of the list page or any of the area pages. There are different modules like accounts receivables, accounts payable, HR, cash and bank management, and so on and so forth. So in that, if suppose someone asks me to select all customers, he or she wants to see all customers. So what we will do, what Microsoft prescribes, is to use a menu item always to open the application object instead of opening them directly. So for example, if we need to open all customers, where the path we will follow is basically accounts receivable, common, customers, all customers. And so in that design pattern, we have to provide a menu item. So menu items can be seen as an application programming interface to the application. This is actually an abstract layer between the user and the actual application object that implements this particular functionality. Changes to the application objects are automatically reflected in the user interface with the menu items which are used. For example, cust table. So for going to the cust table, we have to follow this path. We have to go to accounts receivable, commons, customer, all customers. And this is what you see. And when you click that, you will see the entire list of customers. But in the background, what's happening? So there is a menu. So we went from accounts receivable, common, customer, and then all customer. So that's how the navigation is set up. So once you see that this menu will have a menu item associated with it. So for us, it's a display menu item. So the cust table list page, if you can see, it's a display menu item, and it is telling in the background AOT that a form called as cus table list page should be open. So this kind of design pattern where you should always make use of a menu item that will help you in understanding, like basically in opening any kinds of forms. uh, Microsoft prescribes is a instantiating application object design pattern. Then the next one which I've selected today is to speak more about searching for records design pattern. So obviously there are tables associated with the, so now in the first slide we in the previous slide we touched based upon cus table. So obviously if there is a form called as cus table, there would be and a table associated with it. So the main techniques for selecting rows obviously in a database would be either you can use a select statement or you can use a query. When there is always an question in the mind of developer, like when should we use a select statement and when should we use a query? So the select statement should be used when the selection criteria are complex, or you are selecting set of records from X++. User is not going to change the selection criteria. But Microsoft recommended pattern or Microsoft recommended method for selecting records from the database is always a query. Why? Query helps you to choose which records you want to select. You can change the range of records to be selected. The selection criteria should not be more complex, and actually the query should be able to accommodate everything. So when you're building a query in the AOT, obviously the query should contain the code, and the query definition is more complex. So see, for example, for cus table, if you go to the init method, here I am building a query called as, so that's the data source I'm providing, the table, and that's how the query is built. So first you will provide the query build data source, and then you will pass the primary key and the value which you need to pass. So that's how you add the ranges, and there are a lot of flexibility when you use a query. The next design pattern which we will be looking after today is parameter system design pattern. So as I mentioned that AX or any ERP for that matter has different modules. So we have accounts receivable modules, we have accounts payable, system administration, cash and bank management, sales and marketing, and the list goes on. But for each module, there are some parameters which you need to assign. For example, today we are looking at the accounts receivable parameters. So here you can see you can specify what you need to what parameters you should have for this particular module. So in order to specify in this parameter system design pattern, you should have three major things. First is a parameters table, then is a parameter form, and then is a for parameter menu. So if you see, this is the form. In the background, if you see, these are the cusp parameters. This is the table in the background, and there is a menu item associated with it. The path for going there is accounts receivable setup, accounts receivable parameters, and there is a menu item which is of type display, and the menu item is called as the cusp parameters. So if you see cusp parameters, this is the cusp parameters, how you will set it up, or how Microsoft has set it up in the AOT. Now, how how the table and the parameter is linked. For example, if you see on the customer tab, or a customer section, there is a tax exempt number requirement set to none and minimum reimbursement set to 10. So if you look at the background, there is in the table of cost parameters, I can see that the minimum refund is set to 10, and the mandatory VAT number, which is the tax exempt number requirement, is set to none. So that is how you link all of these. So all of these are linked: the form, the menu item, and the fields which you have entered. It is related to the exact matching parameters table. So this is a parameter system design pattern which will be almost used by in all the modules. Each module should have a parameter system design pattern, and every module will use it. You can always customize this also as and when on ad hoc basis required. The next is the next design pattern which I have selected for today's discussion is multi-selection design pattern. So obviously there are instances where you will require to select different records of the table. So we are here, for example, in the customer table, we require list of we have selected a bunch of records, for example, all customers, and here are my customers. So I have selected a bunch of customers. So this particular design pattern can make the multi-selection possible. So the situation, let's assume a situation where user has selected several records in a grid, and you want to make possible to exactly, you have to tell the system that only these many selected records you should process the information for. So the solution which the system should do is it should select your selection, and if there is no selection, only the current record or the first record should be selected. So how should we implement it? So the implementation happens in the form data source, which contains a method that will help to catch this particular selected records, these selected records. Basically, it happens in a grid or a form. And one option a developer will think would be to loop. Either he can use a while loop or a for loop, or just the select record. For example, let's see on the clicked method here in this for loop, we are, if the condition satisfies, then we will get the first marked record, or else we would get the current record, and we will continue so on and so forth till our information processing is done. So this is a very widely used design pattern. In most of the list pages and wherever the grid is there, people use this design pattern. The next one is the change company design pattern. Obviously, in a very big organization, one legal entity or one company does not solve the purpose. So obviously, I have used the demo data here, and in the Contoso domain, there are so many legal entities which you can see. There are legal entities like BRMF, BRRT, DAT, which is a default company, and so on and so forth. So obviously, when you need, sometimes you won't always select the first one of the list. Sometimes you will require data from US01, or you will require data from Contoso Consulting France, or from Brazil. So what is the syntax and how we can achieve data from different companies. So a change company design pattern is used for that. Basically, we have to alter the database setting to another company. How can we achieve that? Generally, you should use the change company syntax. So I have an example which I have selected. So for example, here we are going to select Custable, and we are changing the company now, because if you follow the syntax, change company expression. So for example, if I have to change the company to BBB, I'm going there and I am selecting a bunch of records for the company BBB. When I come out of the loop, the default company is changed back to AA. Now, if you want, you can select the data of AAA, or if you want to change company again to CCC, you can do that. So this change company method helps us to change the company and get whatever record and information or details associated with that particular company. So this is a very widely used, because sometimes you write a code, for example, you're generating a positive pay file, and you have like 10 companies. Obviously, you have to have that flexibility where the code is generic, but every company of yours should receive that particular flexibility. So basically, that code redundancy and generic code can be used widely over all the companies because of this particular design pattern. So this is a very sleek design pattern and widely used. So those were the design patterns. Now moving on, let's try to understand best practices. What kinds of best practices you can, as a developer, implement in your coding, in your organizational coding, and in your department coding? Obviously, many of us would be practicing that, and it's a very broad topic. I have tried to cover some of them, which we will be discussing in the going slides forward. So always try to keep your business and user interface logic separate. For example, as I told you that Microsoft Dynamics AX is a 3-tier design system where you have a client, where you have an application object server, that is your AOS, as the second tier, and then you have a database server. But the presentation layer, what the user sees, is the client. User is not aware what's happening in the background. Only the developers know that, or the system administrators know that in the background we have an object server and we have a database server. But the presentation is always in the client. So it is very important to always keep a clear interface between the presentation logic and the business logic. Never ever mix these two types of logic. Business logics must be implemented always in classes and on tables. Never design your business logic so that it has direct reference to forms or reports. The design of the business logic must enable any relevant form or report to use it. Remember, Microsoft Dynamics AX not only just communicates with the components inside the software or inside the application, but it can always interact with application outside of the application. For example, any third-party application, if you want to receive data from a third-party application, or if you want to send some data to the third-party application, you can always make use You will have some kind of web services or something, some business logic. So you can always make use of X++ scripts that will create, for example, sales quotation, which you want to send somewhere or bring somewhere. So you have to keep your business and user interface logics always separate. Now, as a developer, always there is a big question in the minds of developer, like where exactly we should place our code. There are different areas, there are different sections in the AOT. Like we have forms, we have reports, we have maps, we have views, we have tables, and the list goes on. So where to place the code? So for forms and reports, Microsoft suggests that never place any code in forms or report, except for calls to classes or table methods that obviously handles complex business logic. Do not place any edit or display methods or forms or report. Then generally we should avoid these things in form. If code cannot be avoided in the form, obviously there are certain times when code cannot be avoided in the form. So we should place the code in the data source or data field level and not at the control level, and call classes from buttons on forms by using menu items. For example, by not using code, you can always call the classes from the button click method or something like that. There are maps, there are views. So use maps for limited number of connected fields. For example, I have a bank account map here. We can use that for when we have like limited number of fields. In our case, we have limited number of fields here. See, account ID, currency. So we are just having a limited number of fields. So we can use maps. Use views. Views are limited select statements used on read-only tables. Do not place much of the code of yours on the views unless you have to use a display method or something like that. There is an example I have selected for bank account view. You can see the view. You can view the view table. It's a very small view, though, but we can place some display methods if you have to. Then for tables, put code that is strictly related to the table as methods on the table. Create table instances for handling one record at a time. Always use field groups in tables. For example, we have a cust table. We have a field group. We should always make use of field groups. When you use field group, IntelliMorph for the internal AX code will automatically update the layout of your related fields. You don't have to take care of everything. You just have to make sure that you're putting the right field in the right field group. AX will arrange it for you. The sequence of the field group can be used to determine the sequence of the fields in the form. For example, if you see so fields in the for example, if it's a identification field group, in the identification field group you have customer number, account number, and so on and so forth. So you can always arrange that when you're using the auto data group property. You can just keep the data group property set to auto, and AX will take care of it. This means that the order in which fields appear is very significant. So if you want to rearrange the orders and stuff like that, always use field groups. Then moving on, we have development tips and tricks in AX 2012. See, as I know, this is again a very broad field. We cannot put, like, we can take hours to discuss this, but I have selected few of them, and we will go through it. So general guidance, naming guidance. Use always camel case naming for member variables, method names, and local variables. Camel type casing is generally the first letter is small and the next following alphabet or following word would be will be uppercase. Use Pascal casings for application object tree elements. Always use Pascal casing where each word of the entire word, like address, country, region, we should use capital for the starting ones if it is an AOT element. Always use prefix parameter names with underscore. So args, whatever parameters you are passing, you should be using underscore args. You can use any other name also if you need to. Do not use Hungarian notification. Do not encode the type of the variable. Incorrect. Never use these Hungarian notification. Avoid prefixing local variables. Never incorrect. Never use this. You should not. Use meaningful and self-documenting names which anyone can understand once he or she goes through the code. There are some database guidance which we should always follow, and there are some exception guidance which we should follow. So let's first cover what are the database guidance which we can follow. Try to include a try-catch method around all transactions that could result in a deadlock. There are various cases where a deadlock can occur, so you should always use a try-catch method in that. Use throw instead of TTS abort. Try to use TTS begin and TTS end if you are calling any select statements or anything. If you're updating any tables or inserting any data or deleting any data, you have to use TTS begin and TTS end. Avoid using display method wherever possible. Never use display method. Avoid. I know that there would be situations where you have to use it, then you can, but these database guidance helps to improve the performance of the system, because obviously when you develop a code, the code is the very important piece that will impact the performance of your system. So as I said, set optimistic concurrency control to yes for most of the tables. Do not include user transaction inside a database transaction. Keep database transaction short as possible. Use where clause in select statements and in queries that align with indexes. Try to use method calls to test your conditions. If any condition fail, you can correct it there and then itself, and you will understand that this method is failing rather than an infinite while loop which can crash the system. Consider specifying a field list because it will increase your performance. Use first only rather than select star from cust table. It would be first only star from cust table. That will obviously save a lot of time. Use aggregates in selection criteria instead of always use aggregates. There are some exception guidance which we should always take into consideration when we are writing a code. Always throw an exception when you think that there would be an error, possible error. You can always throw an exception. You can always put some info logs so that even it's good for the users to understand. Always use info warning error functions. Use throw with a static helper. Throw which are targeted, at the developer level. Do not throw any exception for an error condition that you will expect will be need to be caught. Do not overburden the system with these kinds of throw exceptions, and do not throw an exception for invalid assumption cases where you know that this is going to occur, like divide by zero error, right? So you don't have to throw any exceptions. Then there are some tips which we can follow for parameters, like text and numeric values related to business processes should never be hard coded. Instead of hard coding, you can use database fields, obviously, or you can use enum values or macros. For example, in this example, in the first scenario, what it is doing is basically selecting a record, a rec ID from the location role, and it is hard coding. Never ever hard code. It is not a very good practice, and obviously a good solution would be to use, so now they have used a logistic location, a role type, which is a enum, and in that they are using the invoice. So same code, everything remains the same, but always try to avoid hard coding when you're using text or numeric values related to the business processes or the business logic. Modifying framework methods. If you override a framework method, be careful where you're placing your code. It is important to identify whether you should place the code before the super call or after the super call. Super is a very important keyword in Microsoft Dynamics AX, because super calls a lot of runtime methods which are related to the kernel level. For example, let's see a solution here. In this case, a range value is added after the query is executed, so the results are not reflected until the query is updated or executed again. For example, in the first area here, the super is above the query build source range, and in this case the super is down. So what Microsoft recommends is using the super at the very end, because super has lot of framework code which performs a lot of critical activities which is not possible, like which are at the kernel level. So super should be the last statement in your code, like after whatever you want to code on that. For example, here in this case, the query build source is kept above the super method. Then design forms so that they are not expensive to open. For example, it should be the user interface or the graphical user interface should be very quick when the form is getting opened. Do not include much code in the init method. A common bad practice is to insert a lot of data before a form is opened. We should not. Expensive queries should be available, but they should not be loaded by default. For example, bad solution is heavy operations in the init method. For example, in this example, heavy code is written in the init method, which will slow down downloading of the form. For example, here there is a, if you see, super is above, and then there is a while select statement, while loop, for calling lot of sales total and so many methods which we should avoid. Obviously, init method is the method which helps the form to load fast. So we should avoid heavy operations in the init method. The queries which we can use in forms, which queries to use in form. So use passive joins if you support expensive query that is not shown in the default view. For example, when the data is shown on another tab, If the data is related to multiple tables in a single grid, make sure that a single query is used to fetch that data. You can use any join, inner join, outer join, based on the ranges you are trying to achieve from the data. If the ranges are added in the code, it should be locked or hidden depending on the need, so that the end user does not change them. For example, let's see what is a bad solution looks like, and let's see what a good solution looks like. When the range is not locked, for example, in this example, a particular form is showing records for the current user only, but the range is not locked for the form. And here the range is locked in this example. In the good solution, and a good solution would be a particular form where the range is locked. So that will help to run this query very faster. So these were some of the development tips. Thank you for attending this seminar or this webinar. Please ask any questions.
Thank you, Shankar. I'm not seeing any questions in the question box right now. We'll wait a couple of moments in case anybody wants to go ahead and ask a question.
Sure.
And Shankar, did you displayed your contact information at the beginning, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Just one comment. Great content, lots of good tips.
Thank you.
So, yeah, and I think we'll go ahead and end now. Not seeing any other questions. So thank you very much, Shankar, and thanks everyone for attending.